Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to make quick introductions to Lek and DK, and then they're going to show you a slide presentation so that you have some visual reference for the work that we talk about following that. And then we'll jump into a discussion about the work and hopefully have time for a few questions from everyone. So DK is the Associate Professor of Architecture and Engineering Design at Penn State, and also Director of what's called the Human Materials Lab, or HUMAT Lab, which I love. He's the founder of Lodo Design in Architecture kind of studio, a TED Global Fellow, a Fulbright Scholar, and a very recent recipient of the United States Artists Fellowship. Lek, or Alalekan Jayafis, Lek, as you like to be known, is a visual artist who came to art through architecture. He has shown at MoMA, the Studio Museum in Harlem, Guggenheim, Vitra Design, and actually is a former recipient of the United States Artists Award in 2021. DK is much more than an architect, actually, like really an architectural thinker and experimenter who creates radical forms, and more recently has been doing studies into ancient West African kind of spatial knowledges and trying to incorporate those into the work that he's doing. Lek creates powerful images and installations, trying to imagine real and imagined alternative futures and histories for Africa and its diaspora. I honestly, given the subject of this event, which is time and reconceptualizations of time, and a kind of, challenging of the mechanical time that we found ourselves in, since the Industrial Revolution, I couldn't think of a better panel to talk to in terms of nuances, exciting experimentations, and really kind of research-based thinking around what time can be, how we can operate really productively in time, and ultimately how it can inform our practices on a day-to-day level. So without further ado, we'll jump into your presentations. DK first, Lek next, and also just to say that given the time constraints, I've asked everyone to keep presentations to focus on 1 to 2 projects, but both DK and Lek have really substantial portfolios, and I urge you to take a look at the full body of their work following the event. DK, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to be here. Very briefly, I work with, or in our practice, Low Design Office, we work very much with communities across different scales. So from a first new town that we designed in Nigeria, this is called Anam, for about 30,000 people, up to a new city in Ghana called Kumbi, named after the ancient Ghana Empire, for about 150,000 people. But working in these kinds of communities with natural materials like earth and bamboo very much introduced me to a concept that we have in Ghana called Sankofa, which means that in order to have knowledge for the future, you have to recover knowledge from the past, from your ancestors. And this led me to actually a much deeper, let me say, engagement with the materiality of architecture and its relationships with space, including a series of installations that we've done leading to the Ghana Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. These are images from it, where we actually deployed this system of what we understand to be a living architecture. We call it Fufuzela, which has a whole story behind it, as a way of introducing into the human scale, let me say, the fundamental nature of reality, as well as trying to challenge how we understand museums, to think of them more as organisms that can live and walk with us in our communities and help us, let's say, time travel. So here you have 2 of the artists, one working in a digital realm and the other in a sort of physical, but both understanding their art as portals to a spiritual reality. As part of this, we also did installations in Germany where we installed these Fufuzela as houses for very powerful objects that have been stolen from Ghana and are still kept, or you could say imprisoned, in German collections. And we were able to house them here with a variety of, let's say, support systems to offer healing for these objects which are sacred and living in the sense of imbued with very powerful spiritual energy. At the latest Venice Biennale in Architecture, we actually redeployed the Ghana Pavilion in a kind of alternative configuration, as well as a series of drawings that we, let's say, came across or were introduced to us and are linked with something called Adinkra, which is a sort of symbolic knowledge system in Ghana. Very quickly, I show you just a few images of this process because we believe, even in the name of our practice, Low Design Office, that in a way, the power of design should not be something reserved only for privileged, but should actually be something which is so basic and fundamental in society. And so you can see in the background, actually, this is a very notorious slum in Ghana called Old Fadama, also sometimes called Agbubloshi, where we actually worked with the local community to develop this spatial technology, which we actually deployed at the Venice Biennale. So from essentially the poorest possible place you could be into this very privileged space of art. Finally, I'll just show you a few drawings without fully explaining them. Some of you may already be able to interpret some of them. In a very simple way, I'll just explain. The symbols on the right are a selection of Adinkra symbols. Each one has a meaning and a history, which is very ancient, and they're usually linked with services where people are transitioning from earth to sort of the afterlife, or you could say funerals. And what we came to understand is that actually this Adinkra means essentially the fundamental structure of reality, which exists as a mediate or an intermediate between physical and spiritual realities. And this is most recently what we're trying to, let's say, bring into the domain of space and architecture with communities, with grassroots people, as a way of understanding that if we think of architecture in terms of living systems, we automatically reconnect with very ancient ideas of cyclical time. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Excited to be here. So, as Cher mentioned, I have an architecturally inspired artistic practice. And part of that is to look at a sort of expansive and elaborate world-building process where I imagine, I guess outside of the vein of architectural utopianism, more a way of reimagining alternate worlds and alternate realities. And so for these two projects, I'm just going to briefly touch on. The one on the left was shown at the Museum of Modern Art in 2021, and the one on the right was shown just recently at the Venice Architectural Biennale the past year. And I like to present them together because they have almost opposing paradigmatic approaches to the relationship of mobility, but there's a lot of similarities within them. One thing I should say is I've been, as of recently, much more interested, instead of kind of trying to prescribe a future that is yet to happen, I've been much more interested in reimagining alternate paths that could have materialized out of a set of particular circumstances. So this first project was called The Frozen Neighborhoods, and it's this authoritarian response to this pretty severe, the kind of premise is that a very kind of authoritative response to a climate crisis that occurred in the kind of mid-70s, basically compelled the United States government to enact what I was calling the mobility credit system. And so that would grant individuals, families, communities a certain amounts of distance they can travel, how often they can travel. And I imagine this, of course, as these sometimes well-meaning, prescriptive legislations occur, they oftentimes impact marginalized communities the most. So I'm looking at Brooklyn, New York, where I've been a resident for the past 24 years, and imagining what a community who has now, I guess, been primarily cut off from the kind of larger world, how they've responded to this very severe legislation. And so these are series of really kind of evocative and elaborate architectural sort of renderings of scenes showing this community engaging in a variety of ecological, environmental technologies that are really about sustainability and about community. So a sort of dystopian premise makes way for a more of a possibly, inspiring protopian outlook, but still really playing with the kind of tensions that occur within that. The next project, so this was at the Venice Biennale, and this was my installation, and I was creating this sort of abstracted departure lounge. So whereas the Frozen Neighborhoods really looks at a community that's sort of undergoing a marriage, kind of closed off, I imagine a few years, decade or so preceding the first project in 1972, or 1X72, indicating this alternate timeline, that the African countries which had gained independence in the 60s has sort of completely expelled the extractive and colonial powers and forces and banded together to form the African conservation efforts, and which then this brought about the development of these massive travel and research complexes that were located in 12 cities, 12 coastal cities throughout the diaspora. So Kingston, New York, Los Angeles, Barranquilla, Havana, etc., Mombasa, looking at a variety of these technologies powered by algal, so the, algal energy, algae energy, really looking at sort of alternative fuel sources that again respond to the idea of sustainability, and not operating within the extraction, the colonial extraction premise. But there's still, as I explore within this process, this African expansionist agenda does have its own tensions and possible pushbacks. What occurs and what happens to kind of local tradition and communities now falling under the banner of this large African conservation effort. So I try to attend to both possibility, but also the tensions and the difficulties of reimagining these spaces. And this is just an aerial view of the lounge we are supposed to be sitting in the Venice Biennale. It is, so the 12 prior protoports, they take place in coastal cities, but this one is embedded in the floodplains of Western Province in Zambia, Baratsi land. So again, that tension of local tradition confronting this massive worldwide African world, expansion model.
Great. Thank you both so much for excellent presentations. You both picked up on the Venice Biennale and the fact that you've recently produced work there. And it's probably worth saying that the theme of the Biennale was the laboratory of the future. And it was curated by Leslie Loco, a Ghanaian-Scottish architect. And that she is speaking about many things when she speaks about the future, but in one sense it's also a kind of shift of the intellectual heart of like architectural thinking, and on another level also this idea of the future of the practice itself. And both of you, I think, are pushing architecture quite hard against the edges. And you spoke yesterday, DK, about this idea that in a way you're interested in architecture that can do architecture's job, so it can bring people together but without having to build the building. And you spoke about the same idea, that essentially this kind of community building kind of like agenda or prerogative of architecture can be achieved, without creating kind of spectacular architectural structures. And I'd like to chat to both of you about that idea, this idea of community, what it means, and how you work with that concept in your work.
Yeah, I'll start. So, I'm very privileged to have a incredible architectural education, but the practice is still very, very exclusionary, very prohibitive, just as a professional practice. And the sort of recognition of capital A architecture, as we call it, often reinforces the sort of self-aggrandizement of the individual, even at the expense of people working in that individual's office, You are told the name of the architect that created this grand project, and there's far more, particularly in a kind of Western context, a celebration of the building itself as field within object, as opposed to how it relates to more broader, cohesive, holistic ecosystems that involve not only sites, but the community and the histories of the community, and function in terms of the use and the way the community both navigates, occupies, and engages with it. And so, as someone who has deviated from a sort of more traditional architectural practice into the world of this speculative reimagining, unbuilt works, I'm really interested in sort of exhuming the processes of architecture, the way it's experienced and engaged with by so many individuals who are not privileged to create grand buildings, but have a very profound and rich history of transforming space and occupying space, physically or spiritually, or through traditions of oral traditions, music. There's so much that goes into the process of producing a building that is very much an act of architecture in and of itself, as opposed to simply just focusing on this thing that often has a negative carbon impact, and again reinforces very prohibitive and restrictive practices around real estate and land and what have you. So I try and through the visual language, through the language of visual architectural representation, really imagine those worlds that respond to that. So you see in the first set of images, the architecture in a way kind of recedes behind the very verdant and lush greenscape in the communities and what have you. It's something for me that of course is ongoing, that I revisit constantly, but my process has been to really work through the process of creating architecture as its own, practice in and of itself.
Yeah. I read something really nice that a critic had written about your work, and they were saying that you are ultimately a storyteller, that you take the storytelling aspect of architecture and really bring that to the fore. And that in a way, the provocation, like for you, algal futures or algae-based technology futures on the African continent is the main character of your story, but that you use architecture to kind of build nuance and to kind of add a kind of clear pronunciation to that future scenario. And I really love the idea of architecture as the way to, I suppose, manifest a future scenario.
Well,
yeah.
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no.
I was going to say, just real briefly, that has been, navigating film, etc. But I think of it more as the architectural medium.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to make the connection that because you had mentioned Leslie Loco, that she wrote a text some years back where she mentioned that she had gone to a museum in South Africa and asked some of the people there, what do they call museum in sort of Zulu? And they're like, we don't have a word for sort of. And she had this conversation about like, what is an architect? And that when she was trying to ask them the name for museum, they said that, she's like, what do you call a place where you go to remember the past? And they were like, we don't need a building to do that. And she also said that, I think the Zulu, I don't speak Zulu, but I think it's something like Unkambi Wesino or something that translates as space magician. That's the closest for architect. And so I felt like when you were also describing your work, people try to figure out, this is architecture or that is architecture, when in a reality, if you think about it from a certain kind of African perspective, the notion of architecture as just being a building is maybe obsolete, and it's much more about how do you just think about space. And space is so many different things. It's mental, it's physical, it's spiritual, it's psychological. So there's all these different dimensions to what space is, and being able to somehow shape or craft how we have encounters with those spaces is architecture, whether it's a building or it's an experience.
I loved what you were speaking about yesterday as well, because we were talking about this idea of putting community and experience at the kind of forefront of your practice. And you were talking about this idea of designing for community, which is something that is commonly discussed and debated within architecture and design. But you were talking about designing for intergenerational communities, and then said designing for communities in the fourth dimension. And I loved that. I thought it was really a future, and that idea of designing for community in the fourth dimensions really struck me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were also talking a little bit because I think that for me there are multiple aspects that are related, right? Because one is many of our, let's say, cities today feel very alien or not human, and sometimes just because it's too removed from nature. And the moment you get closer to nature, the reason why we invent words like biophilia is because nature connects us to this sort of cyclical nature of time. I mean, even in English, soil is the same word as soul, because you are essentially your microbiome. And when you die, your night soil sort of recycles your body and you become the soil. So your sort of soul, I mean, even in a Khan worldview, you are not your body, you are a spirit being. And your spirit being is going to pass through multiple iterations on Earth. So you naturally are going to have cycles because some of the ancestors come back in new form, and you have to always be thinking in terms of much longer sort of time frames than just sort of an individual life.
Yeah. I love the fact that we're discussing soul in an architectural kind of conversation, because I don't think that happens enough. And we were speaking yesterday about the idea of having a soul on a kind of, continuum, or a kind of like a level that is beyond the kind of material life that we live. And you were speaking about how a Khan belief has, as a model, this idea of a reincarnation into the physical world, but this kind of continuous level of the soul that kind of dives in and out. And then you began to kind of compare this to how we might think about materials. And I really love this idea that you were speaking about, like, urging young designers and architects to think about the kind of spiritual dimension of materials, and the fact that they are in an ever continuum. Things don't go away; they just are like manifested differently over and over and over again through time. And in a way, it was so much more compelling than thinking about the circular economy, for example, which is something so separated from where we are, and is ultimately still quite extractive and still quite industrial, really. It's still absolutely plugged into that model. But this idea that you could think about, the kind of life force almost of materials, and how you kind of temporarily shape them, and then they're kind of moving back into another plane. It'd be great if you could chat to us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in a simple nutshell, I would say, I mean, we started this closer investigation of materials came out of work we did in what's typically called an e-waste dump, but this Agbogbloshie scrapyard where, Lake, you've also done work reimagining e-waste. I mean, in many places people, I mean, even like a phone here, when you throw it away, you kind of don't know what's in it. But there's lots of materials in here, and we recycle these materials. And this knowledge is very ancient. I mean, if you go to school, like the schools we went to, you study things like chemistry, but no one tells you that word comes from Kemet, which is the name of ancient Egypt, because they were working with materials through what we came to understand as chemistry. And that understanding of materials was never limited to a kind of purely secular idea of science. It was related to matter and spirit were interlinked. So for me, that came actually, we learned that from working with the local community, where they were actually mining materials out of the e-waste and recovering them. And typically they're shown in the media as this sort of poor, ignorant African people that are hurting themselves in the environment, which is also somehow true, that there's a lot of pollution that comes out of it, and we work to try to improve it. But we came to understand that they actually were a continuum of peoples that have for thousands of years recovered materials out of the earth and cycled them. And so they were actually doing practices that were very ancient, and they understood the materials as spiritual as well as physical.
You know, that's interesting way to kind of segue into my thinking about why I have been much more interested in alternate pasts than about the future. I think our kind of popular imagination of the future deals with a sort of very compartmentalized and iterative way of looking at the future. There's the past, there is the present, and then the future is somehow this untainted, infallible space of opportunity. But a lot of the reclamation of the excesses of capitalists, the detritus, and we can get into, you know, where this waste ends up, where fast fashions end up, what they do to those communities, and how that informs, you know, on the broader environmental impact and how it's part of that really kind of exacerbating condition. But both in terms of the technology that we have to repair a lot of the damage that these systems have wrought, and just the excess of material that we have, it's already all here. You know what I mean? And we keep, and you know, the technology that we have operates on this sense of like controlled obsolescence, right? Your iPhone is gonna need to be updated, and they're gonna tweak the camera to make it better, and then you're going to return your iPhone, and ostensibly it will be recycled, but we know that very often is not the case. So I'm much more interested in how we begin to look back and how we understand that the past is so deeply connected to the entire arc of time, right? And it's not something that we leave behind. It's something that is always present and always there and always reverberating out, you know, throughout the future, throughout the present, deeply connected to the past, which is why I liked, you know, when we were talking yesterday, your comment about you're building for a community, but you're not just building for a static community that exists in this point in space and time. You're building and you're responding to the sort of history of this community, of the culture, of the knowledge systems that have been handed down, right? And if you do it in a way with, you know, that the focus is really on the care and the specific culture of the community, you acknowledge those things, right? And you bring them into, you know, this intergenerational process, right? So it's you know, I think I'm kind of trying to challenge the notion of futurity as just a more technologically advanced or a more evolved space to consider design, community engagement, building, what have you, you know?
Cher, if I may, just to say, like, I think what I love with that too is that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you're saying that you have this kind of alternative view of futurity, but that if I were to say, it's almost like thinking about time as space, because we know that we can get on a plane and go somewhere, but we other times people will be like, oh, you can't go into the past. But I feel like I particularly love the first piece you showed tonight, or this today, because in a way you're saying that we also can go into the past. We literally can go into that past and learn from what might have been. And to me, when I look at it, I feel like I am completely reconnecting with that past, almost in a way invoking it. In a similar sense, I feel like yesterday in the Louvre there was this very ancient kind of book of poetry from like the 15th century or something, and I can't even fully read Arabic, but you feel like when you look at it and you see those pages, it's as if you're transported to this other time. There's a direct link between that past and the present, and I think we lose a lot when you obscure that, and we forget that you're literally taking us in a wormhole to these other realities, I feel like.
Yeah, and you know, we were discussing it yesterday, but the future is not this sanitized space. And I think by contending with the past, we acknowledge that. There's a belief that the future is a kind of space of pure objectivity, and science and technology is a space of pure objectivity. But our advancements that we exist with now have a very, very serious political capital dimension to them that resource curse on the continent here, which was completely underdeveloped. That's not technological advancement if you're leaving individuals behind or exploiting individuals behind. You know what I mean? So that lack of balance, that you mentioned, like the natural order of things.
Nice. I'd like to turn our kind of final question to the audience. I'm sure there's a lot of people here who work in design and architecture, and one of the main kind of like realizations I have, in a sense, from the conversations that we've had, when we speak about things like the spirituality of materials, or designing for community in the fourth dimension, or just the kind of overt discussion around spirituality and what that means. And I guess the thing that I'm really struck by is that the language that we have for architecture and design is very technical, and it's very process-driven, and that somehow it doesn't really make space for this kind of what now would be deemed kind of esoteric language, right? But that in doing that, it also kind of distances our like hearts in a way from our practices and our objects. And I'm interested, yesterday you were both talking about this idea of how you feel that, you know, young students of architecture and design should be kind of actively going out and trying to create a new mythology and language for their practices, like really working out, almost daring to be spiritual in the kind of space of design, and to say like, well, based on my spiritual understanding, these are the codes and guidelines for my practice, and this is the way that I speak about it. And I'd love you to talk a bit more about that, because I think that's, you know, that in itself is quite a fundamental shift, this idea that to reconceive of how we work in design, to reconceive of how we work in design in relation to the environment, there maybe is also a kind of a language shift that comes with that mental shift.
I don't know, the first maybe two thoughts that come to my mind is, one is maybe linked to this idea of discovery, which is that I'm sort of discovering, even having just had some of the conversations that we had, I can't speak for you, but that I do feel like there is a generation of somehow emerging, whatever you want to call it, design, architecture, art folks. I think I know the West African space more, who I think are engaging with these broader issues in a variety of ways. And I've oddly enough started to discover that many of us, it's intergenerational knowledge, where we all had these fancy educations in a kind of Western context, but then suddenly there's this other knowledge system that you realize has been kind of propelled through you, and you're just sort of there. So that's one thing I feel like maybe I'm discovering. And the other one has to do with convergence. So just even outside of architecture and technology right now, everything is converging, because essentially the same way that digital technology completely transforms society, quantum is just beginning to enter, and quantum cuts across all the domains. So biology, physics, chemistry, all realities are linked at the quantum level, and the quantum level doesn't exist in time. So you have such things as superposition, and you have entanglement. So things can have relationships faster than the speed of light at the quantum scale, and that's well known within physics, but we're just beginning to tap into it technologically. But I think that's going to bring us very much back to a lot of these very ancient and African idea sort of knowledge systems.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, I've pretty much defined my art practice based on my architectural education. So this, for me, it really resonates with me. I loved the studio environment, and I particularly loved, you know, we were talking yesterday, the difference between a kind of architectural education versus when I was TAing some engineering students. They were treating the design problem as like solving for X. You know, I have a chef and I have a mechanic, and I'm designing a house for both of them, and I've solved it, you know, in a very clear, functional, practical way. But for myself, I was much more interested in kind of generating that narrative and generating that story and getting at the core of what those interactions are, and really building up a kind of not just conceptual framework, but an actual kind of narrative, and then, you know, showing, you know, the symbols, you know, you set the parameters for what you're designing. And in architecture education, you're effectively letting the jury know the boundaries, the parameters, the rules, the codices, the sample sets that you're working from. And then the critique of the work is to, based on what you're telling the jury, how well you're adhering to that, you know? And I think there's something very beautiful in that you make up the rules, you set the gravity, you set this entire thing, but then the audience engages with it in a way they're trying to make sense or find, you know, either how it connects with them or how well you kind of maintain a sort of consistency of your thought and your idea. And I say all of that to say, when I present my work, it's probably most well received by students, you know? I think, you know, like I say, you know, I do this for the kids, right? And I think, you know, when I show my work, wherever I'm showing it, students are always empowered by seeing the work, because they have a lot of curiosity and personal inquiry that connects to their identity, to their histories, to their families, to the journey their families have taken to this country or within this country, that they're really excited about exploring through architecture. And we don't often think that architecture is a space to examine those things, you know? I was fortunate that I went to Cornell University, so at the time in the 95 to 2000, I feel they really encouraged that kind of exploration of identity and whatever materials you wanted to use, or what visual language, whether model making, filmmaking, you know, you just had to justify why you're doing that. And students are really exciting about being able to connect their personal histories. And so in encouraging that, and in giving, you know, more kind of weight to these speculative examinations. You know, you mentioned chemistry and these other fields and quantums. Another, you know, sorry to be rambling and discursive, but another criticism of mine with architecture is that architects are incredibly arrogant, and they really silo themselves instead of engaging with a more kind of interdisciplinary, you know, collaboration with other departments in the university. And I think much more of that needs to happen. Much more of that needs to supplant and kind of bolster these stories and narratives as well.
I mean, on that note, I think it would be really, we've got 5 minutes left, and actually, you know, speaking about designing for the kids, It'd be interesting to know if there's any kind of, architecture students or beyond, of course. But if there's any questions for DK and Lek, yeah.
Microphone.
Hello, my name is Zakia Al-Amri. I'm a recent graduate student of architecture. I think my question would be, when you graduate, you want to do a lot of things. When do you know when to give up on something? Because I've done a lot of things, product designing, curating, art. I've done a lot of things. And I feel like I want to do a lot of things. But when do you feel like you have to let go of that thing? When did you guys realize that is not for me?
That's a fantastic question. It's something, because I really took a very non-traditional trajectory. So I graduated in 2000. I moved to Chicago to work for a very traditional architectural large firm. Before I even started that job, I realized that I would be designing doorknobs, and I just didn't want to do it. And so it wasn't even a give up. It was more of just an understanding that I would be draining myself pursuing this practice, And I think now with things like social media and that it is easier to collaborate, you can find ways to pursue and continue your journey without necessarily giving up anything, right? You can find ways to fold it in. You can engage with different people who have sort of a similar way of thinking about it, or you can, work, like that collaboration is much more, much more possible, I think, now. But then, of course, it comes to the reality of you have to feed yourself, pay for health care, and all these things. Yeah. If you live in the States, right, that like you're dealing with that reality that you really have to contend with. But I mean, I just knew what I was not going to be able to do, and I knew that it just wasn't going to be the life that I wanted. I don't know that I've necessarily given up anything. I've made my way back to architecture in a sense, in building through like large-scale public artwork. I found ways to reconcile, the more traditional aspects of building and architecture and collaborating. So I think it's just a sort of kind of serpentine journey and path.
DK, I might go straight to another question so we can get one more in.
That's fine.
But basically, you're saying don't give up on anything. Just kind of
you can transform or weave through it.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Abdul Qadir Damani. I'm from Algeria. I used to be an architect a long time ago, and I gave up. And after I became a historian of art and philosopher. And I was director of a collection of architecture. And while I'm looking to both your works and the way you want to come back to the real definition of architecture, because we know that architecture is arche and tectonicos, which means to build the origins. In fact, architecture have never been about the future. Each building is just a new origin. But my question is about the filiations. What you're doing looked to me like very close to what happened in the 70s and the 60s in Italy, for example, with the radicals like Superstudio, Archizoom, etc., all these people who take a decision that I call that the building is just a copy of the original architecture, which is the drawing. Because usually the building is never like the drawing. Even the Louvre Abu Dhabi, when you see the drawing of Jean Nouvel and you see what was realized, it's a copy. It's not the original, because the construction changed things. So I'm thinking about this need that we have from a long time ago, 40 years, that architects want to come back to drawing and abandon buildings. Are you in this filiation? What are your feelings about all these European radicals and how you deal with that? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of different, let's say, radicals within the field of architecture. So, but many of them, I would say, even those who are somehow in what we call the past, I see them as brother, sister, cousins, and we're all, let's say, in it together. But I think for me, it's maybe, I'm not sure I see the drawing as the real architecture. You could say, I think maybe the real architecture is the idea, and in the physical world that we live in, architecture is just a vibration. It's sound and it's light. So the drawing is just a reflection of that, but I think for me, if I try to summarize my reading of it from, I guess, the lens I was trying to share today, it's that, yeah, architecture is a kind of vibration as we experience it, which any vibration in a way is emotion which originates from somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is just trying to really expand the definition in a way that I think would just support more diverse and abundant kind of narratives around architecture. As I mentioned in the beginning, architecture has been an enormously privileged space and an incredibly exclusionary practice. You know, I've been, fortunate. Many others have had to abandon it. Even when I was in school, 10 students left to go to, engineering or something else because of when they discovered what the salary would be for an architect. But again, so what I was talking about was the kind of interdisciplinary collaborations. All of these expand. Architecture doesn't occur in a vacuum, but architects tend to think that it does occur in a vacuum. But you're really defining space for community, and architects tend to think that architecture is this apolitical thing. It's not at all. You know what I mean? It's at the behest of a kind of real estate development complex and all of these things that are not siloed. They're deeply connected to the real world, and the more kind of we bring in people who engage with all aspects of the real world, I think we can shape architecture to be much more than simply producing a building that an architect, puts their name on and 100 years
Which goes back to the idea of the gentleman, that in a way it's the map or the drawing that is maybe where the architectural substance lies.
Yeah.
We could continue having this conversation all day, and I would love to. And I'm sure there's more questions, but sadly our time is up actually for this one. So thanks so much everyone for coming, and thank you so much, DK and Lek.
Thank you.